All right, boys and girls, I am so super excited that it is Friday and this is your last reading lesson for the week. This is also the last reading text in this module. You have completed module 0 as of today. All right, so this is lesson number 5. And in today's lesson, you get to answer your essential question. And that is, how does reading help us build knowledge? All right, so we're going to complete our analysis of Thank You, Mr. Fokker. So in this lesson, this is the end. So it is the essential question, how does reading help us build knowledge? I said you would answer that at the end of the module, and today is the end of this module. On Monday, we start a new one. And then we also said after we finish the book, Thank You, Mr. Fokker, you should answer the focusing question. And that is today. Today is the last day that we are on Thank You, Mr. Fokker. And you should now be able to answer, what does reading mean to Tricia? And Thank You, Mr. Fokker. And then the content framing question is, for today's lesson, how does Thank You, Mr. Fokker build my knowledge? It's kind of like this one up here. How does reading help us build knowledge? How does Mr. Fokker help us build knowledge? All right. And we do all of these things to help us also improve our writing. All right, so one thing I would like for us to do to activate our prior knowledge is to describe to a learning partner, to describe to an adult, someone who is there at your house, describe to them one idea you learned from reading Thank You, Mr. Fokker. Do that now. Very good. I'm so excited to see and hear all of you sharing those things that you have learned with an adult or a partner. So now we are going to talk about that focusing question and content framing question again. This one is our content framing question. And that question was, how does Thank You, Mr. Fokker build our knowledge? So let's first remember, what is knowledge? What does that word knowledge mean? Think about it. Yes, knowledge means understanding or knowing things. So instead of saying knowledge, we could say understanding. How does Thank You, Mr. Fokker build my understanding? Or how does Thank You, Mr. Fokker build my knowing things? So today we're going to revisit the text and we're going to deepen our understanding of it. And then you will reflect on how the information in the text builds your knowledge. And you're going to share that with someone, and you will consider how the texts build your knowledge of the world and of ideas and skills. So be thinking about, why is it important for readers to think about text to build your knowledge? Okay. So what I would like for you to do is to think back to the book, Mr. Fokker, and think about what you learned. Reflect on the knowledge that you built by reading Thank You, Mr. Fokker. What did you learn? So you could start out your writing by saying, instead of how does, you could just say, Thank You, Mr. Fokker built my knowledge by, or my knowledge was built by reading Thank You, Mr. Fokker. And you're going to tell me how your reading has improved. What knowledge did you build? This is an activity that you will answer on your own, because it is the content framing question on the very last day that you should now be able to answer. All right, so you're going to pause the video, and then you're going to go to your Seesaw account, and you are going to write down, how does reading Thank You, Mr. Fokker, how did that build your knowledge? You may pause the video and go answer that question and then come back when you have answered incomplete sentences. How does "Thank you, Mr. Falker" build my knowledge? All right, so now we're going to talk about the story. Thank you, Mr. Falker. Okay, so write a reflection or have a class discussion on what you learned to answer that content framing question. So think about what Trisha learned. What did Trisha learn? Yes, Trisha learned to read, but how did she learn to read? She learned to read by not giving up, okay? So today, our knowledge journal, on the very last day of a book or a module, we will always write a knowledge journal reflection. And so in this lesson, how has reading built your knowledge? I think that's how has reading about reading, because the Thank You, Mr. Falker is about a book about reading. So how has reading, that even confused me a minute ago. So how has reading about reading built your knowledge? So what did you learn about reading through you reading stories about a little girl learning to read? Again, it's all about your knowledge being built. Okay, what is the most important thing Trisha learns from reading in Thank You, Mr. Falker? And explain that remember that the knowledge journal will be a place for you to record your growing body of knowledge from this module. And as we reflect on what we have learned and how we learned it. So you have been building knowledge through reading a story called Thank You, Mr. Falker. And Thank You, Mr. Falker was also about reading. So how has reading about reading built your knowledge? Think about what is building knowledge. Remember, building knowledge is building understanding. So why is it important to build your understanding, especially of reading? And you're going to write a response throughout this module and other modules to track the knowledge and skills that you have learned in each text. All right, so how do I improve my writing from my reading? So what is the essential meaning of Thank You, Mr. Falker? So make sure that you always go back and look at your journals and your entries. You can find those in your journal in Seesaw, and then make sure that you're sharing those thoughts with someone. Once you have reviewed your information and shared it with someone, that will give you a better understanding of what you want to write based on your responses. That way you can always go back and add more information or give it another idea once you have talked to someone else about it. So your lesson for today called for you to write a reflection in your knowledge journal about how has reading about Trisha learning to read built your knowledge. And then you're also going to answer, how does Thank You, Mr. Falker build your knowledge? So boys and girls, I would discuss these things with an adult. That way you have a better understanding of what you are going to write. So remember, you can go back to your journal to see the other things that you wrote down about Thank You, Mr. Falker. Read your comments and your writing, and then add 1 or 2 more sentences to your work. And boys and girls, that is it. That is what we are doing today. How does thank you, Mr. Falker, build my knowledge? That's what you should be able to have answered today. All right, boys and girls, that is it. This is lesson 5. This is the last module or the last lesson in module 0. So get your thinking down about what Mr. Falker has done for your knowledge, for your understanding about reading, and write those ideas down. All right, that is it, boys and girls. I hope that you have a great day, a great weekend, and I will see you on Monday. All right, bye-bye.